Daf Yomi, Tractate Chullin, page 32b. The Gemara is the last line of 32a, so let's start there. The Gemara says, Shachat es haveshet v'chule v'hodalo Rabbi Akiva u'raminu elu trefois b'behema. The Mishnah teaches if one cut the gullet, Rabbi Akiva conceded to his opinion, and the Gemara raises a contradiction from a Mishnah at the beginning of the next chapter in 42a. These wounds constitute trephot in an animal. Now we're in the top of 32b with the words nekuvat haveshet upesuat hagalgeres. An animal that has a perforated gullet, where the perforation goes through the wall of the gullet, or one with a severed windpipe. According to this Mishnah, the severed windpipe renders the animal a treifa and not an unslaughtered carcass. Rabbi Akiva reconsidered his opinion and conceded to Rabbi Yehoshua. In accordance with the opinion of which Tana is that Mishnah, Amarove loy kashya kan shishachad ulebesoy pasach kan shishachad ulebesoy shachad. Shachal v'zoy pasak nifseles b'shchita hi pasak v'zoy shachat ki davar achal garam la lipasak damyam. Rava said this is not difficult. Here the Mishnah is referring to a case where one cut the gullet and ultimately severed the windpipe, not in the standard manner. There in the Mishnah in the next chapter is referring to a case where he severed the windpipe not in the standard manner and ultimately cut the gullet. If he cut the gullet and ultimately severed the windpipe, the animal was rendered unfit during its slaughter, therefore it assumes the status of an unslaughtered carcass, according to the principle of Rabbi Yehoshua. But if he severed the windpipe and ultimately cut the gullet, it is as though another matter caused the animal to become unfit, therefore it assumes the status of a trefa. Eis fe Rabbi Acham bar Huna lerove shachat zaveshet pasak esagalgeres pasak esagalgeres v'achakach shachat esaveshet nevelo. Rabbi Acham bar Huna raised an objection to Rava from a Braita. If one cut the gullet and then severed the windpipe, or if one severed the windpipe and cut the gullet thereafter, the animal is an unslaughtered carcass. Apparently, contrary to Rava's statement, the order is irrelevant, and even if the windpipe is severed first, the animal assumes the status of an unslaughtered carcass. Rava said, say that the latter case in the Braita means not that he cut the gullet thereafter. Rather, it is a case where one severed the windpipe and had already cut the gullet at the outset. Omar le shtei tshuvois v'dava chadainu gemai zavoida atanan v'achar kach. Rabbi bar Huna said to him, there are two refutations of the statement, meaning of your attempt to answer the difficulty from the Braita. One is that if the second case in the Braita is one where he initially cut the gullet, then that is identical to the first case in the Braita. And furthermore, didn't we learn explicitly in the Braita, or if one severed the windpipe and cut the gullet thereafter, the animal is an unslaughtered carcass? Rather, Rava said the use of the term trephot in the Mishnah in the next chapter is not to the exclusion of unslaughtered carcasses. Rather, the Tana teaches that the term in a general sense meaning, these wounds serve to render an animal forbidden, and there are some of them that are unslaughtered carcasses. For example, an animal with a severed windpipe, and there are some of them that are trephot. V'lichashov nami dechizkiyo, d'yamachizkiyo sa gistro nevelo. V'lichashov nami d'rami elazo, d'yami elazo, nitlo yerech v'chalal shelo nevelo. The Gemara objects to that interpretation. If the Mishnah is listing those circumstances that render the animal an unslaughtered carcass, let the Tana consider the circumstance of Chizkiah as well. As Chizkiah says, one rendered the animal like a shard by cutting it into widthwise. Its halachic status is that of an unslaughtered carcass, even while it is convulsing before its death. And let the Tana consider the circumstance of Rabbi Elazar as well. As Rabbi Elazar says, if the hind leg of the animal was removed, and its recess is obvious, C21a, it is an unslaughtered carcass. Ay, 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 ay. Ki chatani nevelo. Gemara explains, when the Mishnah teaches the case of the slaughtered carcass, in the case of the animal does not assume that the status imparts impurity while alive. But the Tana does not teach the case of an unslaughtered carcass when the animal assumes that status and imparts impurity while alive. For example, the cases of Chizkiah and Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Shamo, Kan Shishach b'Makom Chatoch, Kan Shishach b'Shalom b'Makom Azoch. Shach b'Makom Azoch, Nifso b'Shchidahi. Shalom b'Makom Azoch, Ki Davar Acher Garim La, Lipasel Damiyah. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish resolved the apparent contradiction between the Mishnah here and the Mishnah on 42a. And he said as follows. Here, the Tana is referring to a case where one cut the gullet in the same place as the initial cut in the windpipe. There, 42a, the Tana is referring to a case where he cut the gullet not in the same place as the initial cut in the windpipe. The reason for the distinction is that if one cut the gullet in the same place as the initial cut in the windpipe, it is an animal that was rendered unfit during its slaughter, and it assumes the status of an unslaughtered carcass. By contrast, if you cut the gullet not in the same place as the initial cut in the windpipe, it is like a case where another matter caused the animal to become unfit. Therefore, cutting the gullet renders it a treifa and prevents it from imparting ritual impurity. Umi amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish hachi. V'yomer Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, shachar zaganem v'achar kach nikbat, harei hakeshera, alma keman nimancha b'nikula namya, hachanami keman nimancha b'nikula namya. The Gemara asks, and did Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish say this? That slaughter can be effective to prevent impurity after the windpipe was severed, but doesn't Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish say, if one cut the windpipe and the lung was perforated thereafter before he cut the gullet, the animal is fit for consumption. Apparently, after cutting the windpipe, the status of the lungs, whose existence, depending upon the windpipe, is like that of an item that is placed in the basket. They are irrelevant to the determination of the animal's status. Here too, when the windpipe is severed at the beginning of the slaughter, the windpipe should be considered like an item that is placed in a basket, in the sense that the animal is considered to have only one siman, the gullet, and cutting of one siman does not affect the animal's status. Rather, Rabbi Chia bar Abba said, Rabbi Yochanan said, the apparent contradiction is not difficult. There in 42a, where it is stated that an animal with a severed windpipe is a treifa, the Mishnah presents the opinion of Rabbi Kiva before retraction of his opinion. Here the Mishnah presents the opinion of Rabbi Kiva after retraction of his opinion. And even though Rabbi Akiva retracted his opinion, a Mishnah does not move from its place. Once this version of the Mishnah was learned in the study hall, it remained valuable, even though it is no longer current. Gufa Amar Shimon ben Lakish Achat Zakone Viachar Kach Nikva Harea Keshera Amar Ravelo Amar Shimon ben Lakish Ela Bereo Hoil V'chaireo Telui Mekone Apivnei Me'ayim Lo. The Gemara discusses the matter itself that was cited previously. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, if one cut the windpipe and the lung was perforated thereafter before he cut the gullet, the animal is fit for consumption. Rabbi said, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish states this principle only with regard to a lung, since a fraction of the lung is dependent upon the windpipe. Once the windpipe is separate, it is as though the lungs were removed from the animal. But with regard to innards that were perforated after the windpipe was cut before the slaughter was completed, no. The animal becomes a treifa because the function of the innards is not dependent on the windpipe. Maskif lo Rabbi Zero. Miachal shenoldu bo simoni treifa hitarto mali bereo mali nemi'ayin. Rabbi Zera objects to Rava's distinction. Since when signs of being a treifa developed in the animal after the slaughter began, you permitted the animal and deemed the slaughter valid. What difference is there to me if the preparation was in the lung, and what difference to me? What difference is there to me if the perforation was in the innards? In either case, the animal should not be deemed a treifa if the signs developed once the slaughter began. Rabbi Zera, Nikfu b'nei ma'ayim ben siman lesiman mahu, b'mitzvah siman rishon lesiman sheni, etaramidin ve'loi lo. But Rabbi Zera retracted his objection, as Rabbi Zera raises a dilemma. If the innards are perforated between the cutting of the first siman and the second siman, what is the halacha? Does the first siman join together with the second siman to purify the animal from the impurity of an unslaughtered carcass or not? And we say, isn't this the dilemma that Ilfa raises? If a fetus extended its foreleg outside the womb while the mother was being slaughtered, between the cutting of the first siman in the windpipe and the second siman, the gullet, thereby causing the foreleg to have the status of a treifa, what is the halacha?